Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. I am the steward of the Stoa, Peter Lindberg. Some of you may know I run the Stoic group here in Toronto, Canada. And obviously we can't meet right now due to the situation. So I decided to launch the Stoa, which I'm viewing as not just a space to talk and practice about Stoicism, but a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And I'm bringing in a lot of people to practice different exercises and to give talks. And today we have a special guest, my friend Greg Sadler. Greg is a APPA certified philosophical counselor. He's the editor of Stoicism Today, and he's the president of Reason.io, which is an organization that puts philosophy into practice. And he's going to give a talk today on Stoic Fortitude. And it's going to be about 20 minutes, and then we're going to open up to questions, a Q&A. And if you have a question for Greg, just write it in the chat box. And I'll ask you to unmute yourself and you can read it. Or if you want me to read it on your behalf, just indicate that in the chat. So that being said, I'll hand it over to Greg.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks for the invitation to come into this virtual space and talk about these things. So I am going to talk about fortitude, or the virtue of courage, but I'm also talking quite a bit about failure and failings. And when Peter approached me about what topic I might want to talk about, that's what came to mind right away, because I think that we don't talk about it enough in terms of Stoicism. I know in our local group we do every once in a while bring up where we went wrong, and then we analyze it. But there's, it's not something that people are often happy to discuss. And it's really important because any mode of intentional living, and Stoicism is one of those, there's going to be a lot of failings and a lot of failures. So Stoicism helps us to understand those and to wean ourselves away from dysfunctional approaches to the inevitable failures that we have. And the reason why I picked fortitude wasn't just because, the alliteration, the nice F sounds or something like that. It's because if we look at what the Stoics actually said about that virtue of fortitude or courage, it's broader than just dealing with fears, and it really does have some resources there to help us deal with the inevitable failures that we run into. So this is going to be kind of restricted in scope. There's so much that could be said about this that I think one could actually write a small book about it. I'm going to talk, and I've already used up probably a minute of the time, so I'm just going to hit on some key points. So I talked about why this issue, and I'll start by talking about a failing of mine that's also culminated in several failures. So all of you know, if you're not involved in academia, all of you are still quite aware that everything has had to go online. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of thoughtfulness. And I've been teaching online for 8 years now. So, when we first got quarantined and told, hey, we're going to extend spring break, you better start shifting the classes online. That first weekend, I thought, oh, this is a perfect opportunity. I can get a lot of this work done right away. And then I found myself, as many of you probably have as well, and this is a topic we could talk about as well at the end, feeling kind of unmotivated, feeling kind of blue and sad, and not getting the things done that I said I would. And that's both a failure, but it's also a failing. And I'll talk about the difference between those in a bit, because it's something that I, often do, more often than I'd like. I create this great Google Calendar full of things that I'm going to do, and then I don't actually get to them, and then I have to revise it and take stock of the fact that the work didn't get done. And who does it affect? Well, it affects my students. And it's not like I left them in the lurch, but I wanted to do all these different things that would ease their transition and keep them from feeling anxious. And I got maybe half of them done, on the scale that I wanted. So, that's sort of a classic instance. I have some duties towards these people that I have relationships with. I know what the right thing is to do, and yet I find myself not getting all of the right thing done. And I think many of you can bring up similar instances in your own, just the last couple weeks. The quarantine and the staying at home and all the anxieties about COVID-19 and the situation that we're in, I think makes this even more important to talk about, because as we put more stress on the systems that we live in and we put more stress upon ourselves, we're going to make more mistakes. We're going to shift into unhealthy ways of looking at things. So let's talk about failings and failures. We often use these words synonymously as if they're the same thing. And I'm not saying that we have to be, grammar police or anything like that about this, but it is useful to make a distinction. We often fail at things, and we do so in determinate ways within situations. That's a failure. And it could be minor. It could be I forgot to take the dog out, and so the dog is upset, and maybe has an accident or something like that. And then it has to be cleaned up and, inconveniences people. Or it could be a really big thing. Like I didn't check into my classes all week, and my students are wondering, where is this guy? What are we going to do? And there's all sorts of possibilities. And then when we realize that we've failed, sometimes we realize that there's something more going on there, that we have failings, that there's things about ourselves that aren't what we'd like them to be. And, our society is very good at giving us all sorts of sometimes correct and very often incorrect information about what our failings would be. You might think about the fashion industry and how it pushes a certain, not just coiffure and set of clothes that should change every season, but body types and what we ought to be investing our time and attention into. Those can make us think that we're failing when we're not really doing so. So we can talk about that as well. We also see failings and failures in other people. And one of the things I think we can be on guard from the beginning against is interpreting failures on people's part as automatically signifying failings on their part. So if I, neglect an email for a while and don't respond to it right away, that doesn't mean that that failure is automatically because of a failing with me of not wanting to address people or being disrespectful or anything along those lines. But, we have to be on guard against that, because that's a natural tendency to read those things into other people's behavior. So as I was saying, in any path of intentional living and personal development, we really ought to expect to fail very often when we're starting it. And, I know just looking at the list of people here, some of you have been practicing Stoicism for quite a long time. And even then, all of those who have been, you can weigh in and say, yeah, we keep on failing as well. But when you're first embracing some Stoic principles and practices, you're going to fail all the time. And, that's just part of the course. It's just like learning a musical instrument or going to the gym and starting a new exercise routine. It makes sense that would happen. And so, dealing with failure productively is going to be very important for us. And we can think about some of the ways in which we fail, and I came up with a list here. I'm just going to hit on some of the general ways, right? Some of them are cognitive. We get mixed up in what we think or assume, or we have incorrect ideas about things, like mixing up what's in our control and what's not in our control. We make mistaken inferences. We follow out automatic lines of thought processes or lines of reasoning that are mistaken. Sometimes we actually just sort of make a mistake, almost like, in mathematics when we wind up with the wrong number at the end and we're not quite sure how we got there, we get the wrong result. Well, we do that with our reasoning as well. But we also have affective ways in which we fail. And this is where I think Stoicism can be really helpful in telling us what we ought to desire and what we ought to be averse to, right? We often desire the wrong things or are averse to the wrong things, or too much, too little. We direct our emotions towards the wrong objects. Sometimes we act on them in ways that are not helpful for us or for others. And we often do realize, if we've been thinking about ourselves and examining ourselves, which is part of Stoicism, that we should feel something better or different, but don't. And we feel that as a failure, right, on our part. There's also volitional modalities. We sometimes choose the wrong things or commit to the wrong things, the bad instead of the good. And then afterwards we say, well, what was I thinking there? We choose things that could be good but end up being bad because we don't pay close enough attention to what we're doing. We start with a good intention but don't follow through on it, or we prioritize things in a way that gets in our own way, that hinders us, to use Epictetus's term. Or sometimes we fail to fulfill the duties that we have, and that leads us into action. Sometimes when we have an action, we don't follow through on it. We don't check up to see whether the result actually turned out the way that we assumed. Or things turn out differently than we intended because we don't act in a pure vacuum. We're within an entire matrix of causes that include other people and the universe itself and all of these processes. And so things go astray, and we have to stay on top of that. So those are all different ways in which we might experience failure. And we might, when we bring Stoicism into the mix, in a way it kind of raises the bar. So we hold ourselves to higher standards than we would have in the past when it comes to our choices and actions and thoughts, and particularly to emotions. For myself, I've struggled my entire life with anger. That's part of how I got into studying Stoicism in the first place. Some of you know the backstory on that, and I'll be happy to share it in the Q&A if people want. The Stoics are very zero tolerance when it comes to anger. And I can say I fail at that probably not every single day, but pretty close. And so, when we begin to hold ourselves to higher standards, we become much more conscious of where we're failing. We also do so, and I think this is a very helpful mental construct when it comes to virtues and vices. When we can give a name to ways in which we don't want to be and is bad for a person to be, and we can give a name to the ways that we ought to be, that would be good for us to be, that helps us to guide ourselves. And we often fail when it comes to the virtues. The entire realm of duties or appropriate actions, officia in the Latin, our relations to others, well, we often fail in those. I'll speak for myself. I often fail in those. Maybe some of you do as well. And Stoicism, reinforces for us, hey, you've got all these connections to other people. You really need to pay attention to them and do the right thing in the fabric of those relationships. And, you might say, oh, well, that makes, in that case, maybe we should get rid of Stoicism. It just makes us more miserable, right? It's not fulfilling its promise of making us happier. And, we might want to think about the legendary sage and the fact that maybe some of you aim to be the sage. I don't. I'm a Prokopton, and I intend to be that my entire life because that's good enough. I just want to get a bit better and a bit better. Just like Epictetus says, hey, I don't have to be Socrates. It's enough if I just make some progress along the way. And I think another thing that Epictetus says is helpful in this. All of you remember the passage from the Enchiridion about the beginner blames everybody except for themselves, right? And the person who's making some progress blames himself, and then the person who's actually made a lot of progress or understands things doesn't blame anybody. And we use this as a classificatory principle. I think we should see this as a continuum instead, as a process where we wean ourselves away from blaming other people and we start focusing more on what we need to change in ourselves and what we need to be, sometimes hard on ourselves about, and then eventually move away from that as well. Doesn't mean that we're ever going to get there entirely and not blame anybody and be totally cool with everything that's going on. Maybe that's not what we need to do. Another thing I wanted to talk about is common mistakes that people make when they fail and how we can look at them from a Stoic perspective. And I think looking at them from the Stoic perspective will happen more in the Q&A. But here's some common mistakes, and you can add your own as well. So the first one is denying that there was any failure in the first place, right? It didn't happen. And then, all of you are familiar with the path of, well, it didn't happen. Oh, it did happen, but it wasn't me. Oh, it was me, but I didn't intend it. Oh, I did intend it, but it really didn't have the bad effect that you're saying it did. All this minimizing that goes on. That is not helpful at all, right? If we fail, we need to actually acknowledge that we did fail. Another big problem that people launch themselves into, or rather set of problems. And actually, when I was thinking about this, I realized this is a very common theme in sitcoms. A person will fail at something, and then they will try to fix it by any means they can, and they don't approach it attentively. They don't approach it with prosoche, as we would say in Stoicism. They're reacting immediately, and the efforts that they make it worse and worse and worse and worse until around the 28-minute mark, everything falls apart, and then we have a nice coming together and we learned a lesson sort of thing. Well, in real life, this approach towards failure often doesn't pay out that way. Shifting responsibilities to others, that's another problematic way of dealing with failure. We actually need to deal with things that are our business, the things that are up to us. Ignoring how we make things harder for others when we fail. That's another common thing as well. And I think if we're Stoics, we have to think about larger systems that we're involved in. So for example, if I didn't show up until 20 minutes into this, I would be putting out however many people are, I can't tell exactly right now, however many people were waiting for this, right? If I fail myself, I let others down sometimes. And that's a matter of justice and a matter of duties. Another thing that often happens when people fail is excessive emotional reactions. And sometimes this can be, guilt or shame. Sadness is a common one. Anxiety, what if people think I'm a bad person because of this? Some of the other ones that come up that maybe you don't experience, but I know I do. Frustration that leads to anger and then lashing out at others, which generates yet another failure, or even a desire and enjoyment in seeing others fail, so that at least it detracts from what you're doing. Another common mistake, I think, is being too concerned about what other people will think and not about what you're actually dealing with in the situation. So how can we approach these things as a Stoic? I think one of the most helpful principles is the dichotomy of control. Thinking about what is genuinely up to us and what isn't up to us. And one thing that we definitely don't control is whether we failed or not. So, once we failed, that is set and that's there in the past. We can tell whatever stories we want about it. And we can reframe things in more productive ways, but the thing happened. And if it came from something within us, a failure within us, that's still there too. And, we can change how we approach it in the future, but we really can't do much more than that. We will have failings and failures with respect to all sorts of things that are indifference. And, those in fact do matter, as Epictetus tells us. The things that are indifference, like say money, it doesn't have no value whatsoever. It just doesn't have the value that a lot of people ascribe to it. And how we use it is important and is up to us. So we can think about those classifications. Prudence has to do with how we use indifference in large part. Same thing with justice, the same thing with fortitude. And we probably should try to work on our skills and abilities that we call virtues that will help us deal well with these indifference. So I think that's one key thing. We look at what is in our control, and we focus on that, but we also try to maintain some focus on what we don't absolutely control but can influence in some way, and we should do that well. Another thing is being concerned about, as I mentioned, what other people make of our failures. And Marcus has a thing that he says at one point, and Epictetus, I believe, has another thing, and Seneca has something similar, where somebody's criticizing somebody else, and they say, well, obviously you don't know me that well, because if you did, not only would you criticize me for this one thing over here that I failed at, boy, you'd see all these other things where I'm screwing up as well. And doing that can kind of help you put things in perspective. I'm not saying you'd say that to everybody, but you can sort of say that to yourself in your mind, and then maybe not feel as bad about the single thing that is weighing upon you. Realism about success rates is also very important. Socrates himself, as Epictetus tells us, went around, and this is his divine mission in Epictetus's view, to go around and tell people, focus on your soul, don't worry so much on these other things. And what was his success rate? About 1 in 1,000. So if Socrates himself was not succeeding all of the time, maybe we need to adjust downward, depending on what it is, our conception of what success and failure are. Maybe some of the things that we think of as failures aren't really failures. And you could say, well, in that case, we go back to the dichotomy of control. All Socrates could do is put the message out there, and, in a very assertive way, which got him killed eventually. But it's up to the other people to take that into account, and that's not up to him. We can also think about what we learn from failures as experiences. Experiences are appearances, phantasiae for Stoicism, which doesn't mean that they have no reality whatsoever. Even reason itself, the faculty of reason, is a system of appearances, Epictetus tells us. So we need to look at how things are connected with each other and whether we're getting them right cognitively and effectively. The last thing I would say, that might be helpful from a Stoic perspective, and this is not just there in Stoic advice, but it runs throughout intentional modes of living, is that we can't hope to fix everything at once. If we discover failings in ourselves, we have to work on them bit by bit. So if I'm, struggling to not drink, 2 pots of coffee a day, which I'm not going to change, by the way. That's my normal consumption. There's other things I can focus on more, like what my students need from me. But if I decided to make that my focus, I probably shouldn't try to do everything else at the same time. And we can remind ourselves, what is the goal of Stoic philosophy? So the stock answers are eudaimonia, right? Good flow of life and tranquility. And how do we actually do that? What does that actually look like? The Stoics tell us, this is where we get to the nitty-gritty of it, that it means understanding and choosing and actually doing the things that we're supposed to do, appropriate actions or duties. They also tell us, and Epictetus is constantly stressing this, that the goal of the Stoic life is to recognize where we are in conflict with ourselves, where we are contradictions. The Greek word for that is mache, literally battle, where we're fighting ourselves, and to work through that gradually, untangling these knots that we have within ourselves. They also think that we are truth-seeking animals. We want to know reality. We don't want to be screwing up all the time in how we're assessing things. So we have to be very realistic about the world and very realistic about ourselves. That means seeing where we're failing. And Stoic philosophy is about a progressive transformation of the person. It's not about an on-off switch where we learn some principles and now everything turns into happiness and tranquility. Instead, we have to do some work. And so here's where we get to fortitude. And I realize I'm already going a little bit long, so I'm going to keep this fairly short. So fortitude is a virtue, right? We often translate it as courage. In Latin, it's fortitudo. In Greek, it's andrea. And like the other the other three cardinal virtues, it's an overarching basket of things. So what does it encompass? It does include the traditional notion of like dealing with fear or anxiety, right? Being brave in the face of danger or stuff like that. But it encompasses more for the Stoics. So Cicero tells us in On Duties that fear is one of the emotions that it helps us to handle, desire is another, and anger is another as well. Those all fall within the scope of this. Arius Didymus, who, you know, if you haven't checked him out, he's worth taking a look at. He gave this epitome of Stoic ethics. He talks about these 5 different aspects to courage or fortitude. So in Greek, I'll give you the Greek terms, and I'll tell you what they mean, and I'll give you his gloss on them, because he doesn't go much further than that. So the first one is karteria. And this we translate as perseverance, but also as endurance, depending on which translation you're looking at. And he calls this the knowledge. They're all types of knowledge, episteme, but they're not like just purely cognitive. They're also, you know, within our habits and our feelings. This is a knowledge that is ready to remain in what has been rightly decided. So when we've decided we ought to do X, perseverance helps us to do that. That's part of what it means to be courageous in this respect. So being courageous doesn't have to be running into the burning building. It could be actually doing the things that you said you were going to do, washing all the dishes instead of saying we'll do them in the morning, you know, to take a sort of trivial example. Another one that's a little bit closer to like the feeling of courage is tharaleotes, intrepidness. It's related to the word for confidence. And he says, this is the knowledge through which we know we will not encounter anything terrible. We can realize that we're up to the challenges in front of us, even if they happen to be, you know, like dealing with this terrible illness that's going on. Another one that they said fits into that is megalopsuchia, which is often translated as great souledness or magnanimity. Aristotle treats it as a separate virtue. The Stoics thought that fit under courage. And it's a rising above. It's a rising above and sort of looking at things from that perspective. So it helps us put things into perspective. And he says it doesn't just apply to trivial stuff. It also applies to the stuff that's genuinely valuable. So we realize that, you know, it is valuable for us to have certain relationships. But if we have to let those go in order to accomplish a yet greater good, then we do that. Another one is what he calls eupsuchia, stout-heartedness. This is something I think a lot of people are attracted to in Stoicism. It's knowledge belonging to the soul, grasping itself as unconquerable, reminding ourselves that we do get to decide, that we are the ones who determine what we're going to do with ourselves and our faculties and our abilities. And then the final one that I particularly like is called Philoponia. Literally meaning loving toil or loving difficult things. And so this is translated as industriousness or diligence. It means being able to accomplish what's proposed without being prevented by the toil that's involved. And this is where, like, you know, we get reluctant sometimes. We encounter things and we're like, yeah, I've got this great idea, this intention. And then, you know, it gets kind of late at night and we're tired and we're like, oh, I'll do that later. And then it doesn't happen. That's a failing, right? And so by being industrious, we can not just keep ourselves from doing that, but we can return back to what we need to do. Epictetus doesn't talk about courage much, but he does talk about all these parts. He doesn't use the word virtue very often. Now, Becker himself, I think many of you know his New Stoicism. He summarizes these in 3 things: courage, endurance, and perseverance. But it covers a lot of the same ground. And he says that we need these in order to be able to exercise our agency that we ought to have. So, you know, this, I think, maybe it's sort of like a little pep talk more than a deep analysis or anything like that, but it gives you an idea about how we can use this virtue of fortitude to approach the inevitable failures that we see, and then the failings within us that we want to work on. The last thing I'll say is, the Stoics are often portrayed as saying that virtue is just a kind of knowledge, right? And that's true. They do think that there's a cognitive side to it. It's not just, having an automatic response. You do need to know what you're doing, and you do need to think about it, and you do need attentiveness. Epictetus talks about us as having the virtues within us as sort of resources that we can draw upon. And that's another aspect to it. These are all part of our nature if we choose to develop it. But the other thing where the Stoics do line up with other virtue ethicists is their emphasis on, if we want to actually have the virtues available to us, if we want to have fortitude, we have to continually choose and practice, and that leads to establishing new habits. That is going to happen over time, and there's sort of a meta level here. We're going to fail at that too. And so we have to be willing to, if we want to use more of the imagery, like the wrestler, pick himself up, dust himself off, and get back in the ring again. And fortitude is the virtue that helps us do that. So fortitude develops itself in its own practice. And the last thing I'll close on is just saying, well, if you do this, it gets better. It gets easier. I'm saying that from somebody who's gone a bit of the way and can see, further on the horizon. Probably some of you are further along with that than I am. But, the message is you can do this. You can deal with failings and failures. And it's okay. In one respect, it's okay to fail because you're going to, and you have to become okay with it. Obviously, you don't want to fail less, but you want to be quite realistic with yourself about what's going on. So fortitude is the thing that we need to focus on. That's my shtick here. So I'll open it up to Q&A.
Cool. So if you have any questions, write it to Greg in the chat box, and I'll call on you to unmute yourself, or I'll read on your behalf. And I'll warm up Greg right now with a question of my own, or maybe I'll share some thoughts, and then maybe we can tease out a question here.
Yeah.
So what was salient is when you mentioned the sitcom thing. Because my wife and I just finished watching the whole series of Friends, and I had an adjacent thought similar to that I noticed everyone freaking lies in every episode. They're lying. Same thing with Seinfeld. Yeah. They're always lying, and you're right. The lying stems from some minor mistake or failure or whatever, and then they make it worse by lying, right? And if they were just being upfront and forthright and truthful, then there wouldn't be an episode, essentially. And what comes to mind is Jordan Hall had his take on wisdom is being in right relationship with reality, which could be just another spin with like living in accordance with nature. And so the thought came to mind, like, what is right relationship with failure? Similar to what you're talking about. So I just throw that out you if you think that's a helpful frame, or if anything came to mind.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, the Stoics think of us as animals that have these sort of basic drives towards things. And unlike the other ones, we have a drive towards truth. And that's where the virtue wisdom gets its beginnings from, according to Cicero, who's just, essentially telling us what Cato said about that. So kind of orthodox Stoic teaching in that case. And I think that's completely right. We want to have a veridical relationship with reality, and we're part of reality. So we want to understand ourselves. And sometimes that can be a very painful truth to see, right? I thought I had all my anger stuff done. And then we start, talking about recipes, and somehow we get into, shouting at each other or something like that. Well, there's a sign that things are not as I thought they were. It's kind of funny with the sitcom thing, as you were talking about that. We're fans of Curb Your Enthusiasm. And Larry David is like, he's an epitome of this. He's sort of, He is kind of stoic about stuff with a lowercase s. This doesn't matter, right? But he's constantly screwing things up worse and worse and worse by making a bad decision and then trying to cover it up in some way. And the notion that we could somehow fix things by lying, okay, that's a false thing, right? So being wise would be realizing, among other things, realizing that you can't fix things just by telling people some sort of story to mollify them, but you have to fix the relationship somehow. And that's probably, in some respects, too messy and boring to make good TV, So.
Yeah. So we'll pivot to the questions, and Sai would like me to read this. So how do you apply this view to the failures versus failings of other people? Seems a relevant aspect in a time when many are eager to criticize others' reactions or lack of reaction in the face of crisis.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we can talk about that in a number of different ways. We can talk about how one interprets it oneself, and whether you're doing the right thing, you could say, in relation to other people's failings, which most of the time is going to be not talking about them, ignoring them, because it's not your business. I get on Twitter, and Twitter is kind of a great place for everybody getting up in each other's business, because even the people who you follow are bringing other people into your stream, and there might be a temptation to correct people, or say, oh, you're totally mistaken about this sort of thing. And I think as a Stoic, you would want to think, well, is it really worth my time to get involved in this particular situation, this particular tiff? Now, if we're talking about people closer to us, maybe those who we have responsibility for. So, like, if my kids are doing something that's not to their benefit or might be harming others, I probably should say something to them about that, and maybe even if I have any sway in the situation, because quite often kids are they really are their own thing, their own little world. Try to influence them and bring them towards what's good. And we could say this, maybe, you think about this, I hadn't thought about this before, but think about the concentric circles that we talk about with Heracles, and we usually bring this up in terms of oikiosis, and loving everybody ultimately out to the ends of the earth and all the human, but there's also that more inner circle where we are more concerned with them, and we probably in times like this probably should pay closer attention. I need to focus, for example, on my students. I don't need to really worry about what my dean is doing, even if the policies that they're doing seem a little bit counterproductive. I need to focus more on my tasks. There will be some people's failures that are going to be bad in many respects for other people, and the most we can do often is say, hey, you're screwing up. Here would be a better path. But right now, well, so let's talk about the COVID-19 crisis. Most countries have some sort of unified response at this point in time. Here in the United States, we don't. It's been left up to the individual states, and some of the individual states left it up to individual municipalities. And so, there have been some very imprudent decisions made in recent times, and we're going to suffer the consequences for them. And strictly speaking, these have to do with what the Stoics would call indifference. Being healthy or sick, wealthy. We're looking at economic collapse in many cases, or poor. But indifference do matter, and we shouldn't just say, oh well, we're Stoics, so long as it doesn't affect my own virtue or vice. I think it's okay to be critical of inadequate responses. But, here we can talk about manner. How do we do that? Do we allow ourselves to get all angry and worked up about it? Do we start calling people names? How do we do it? And Seneca himself, this is a bit of a side note, says that in some cases, even though you're not angry, it could be useful to look angry if you're dealing with people who only understand that point of view. He talks about a judge displaying anger towards a criminal defendant. And maybe our legislators only get, when we seem upset with them, but that doesn't mean that we actually have to be upset. So that's kind of a long-winded answer. But
So next question, and just a disclaimer on the questions, we might not get to all the questions, and I'm not going to be reading it in order. I'm going to use my discernment to kind of yes and the previous thing Greg said. So Alex, you have a question for Greg. Would you like to go off mute and ask it? Alex, I'll unmute you if you like. There, you're unmuted.
Great, thanks, Peter. Thanks, Greg, for your presentation. I was wondering about fear and Stoicism and the virtue of courage specifically. Um, I guess I'm wondering what happens when a person acts courageously. Does fear disappear completely, or is it just somehow transformed and managed? Just puts it under our control. Because I've read that for the Stoics, like the Stoic sage lives without any fear at all. And I know for somebody like Aristotle, fear is always going to be there, and it's just a matter of kind of managing it well. So
Yeah, so for Aristotle, that's not actually the case. And Aristotle's closer to the Stoics on this. Aristotle says that the courageous person will feel fear in the face of things that are genuinely fearful, but they're not going to feel fear when it doesn't make sense to feel it the way somebody who, say, has a phobia does, right? So if you're in the Mediterranean in the ancient world on a ship and you're in the middle of a storm, and you're the poor guy who's got to go up above and like secure the things that are otherwise going to move around, that makes sense to be scared, right? But you try to master the fear and not allow it to dominate you so you can do the right thing. And the Stoics have a similar thing. So in some cases, it will mean not feeling fear. And this is where the cognitive side comes in. If you understand that some things aren't really scary, even though people say that they are, or your first reaction is to think that they are, you can avoid feeling fear. But even the Stoic philosopher, we won't talk about sages, but even the Stoic philosopher is going to have these pre-emotions where the body just kind of reacts to things. Maybe the adrenaline starts flowing, and then they manage it. But there will be some things that will be genuinely scary, and this is where I guess I'm tempted to think that modern Stoicism would acknowledge a wider range of the Stoics had what are called eupathai, right? The good emotions, the good emotional states, and caution, eulabeia, is one of those. And that's feeling fear when it's rational to feel fear. I think maybe we would be a little bit more wide in our scope. So, for example, my kids are down in Indiana right now. They're separated from me by 2 states. And I know that they're doing okay living out in the countryside, but I can still feel some concern for them. And now, does that have to rise to the level of something where I'm like calling them up all the time or texting them, "How are you doing? You're not coughing yet," or anything like that, right? No, that would be clearly off base. But exhibiting what the Stoics called caution, that does make sense in a lot of cases. And so let's think of very practical terms. We live in an apartment complex here, and I have a wife who's immune compromised. We have quite a few younger people living in the complex who seem rather cavalier about contagion and social distancing and things like that. And, we have to be careful. We have to be cautious about that. And so there'll be some things where, if somebody wants to get on the elevator with me, my reaction is, no, take the next elevator, buddy, and it may seem kind of rude. And I can do that without feeling, this thing gripping me, this fear in my gut. But it is still within the same affective domain. And if I see somebody doing something really dumb, like, I don't know, licking the elevator buttons, I should feel some sense of, like the hairs on the back of my neck going up. Something was really wrong there. That's kind of a silly example, but you get what I'm saying, right? So there's kind of a complex spectrum, you could say. In some cases, it's going to keep you from feeling fear at all because you've realized this isn't really something scary. In other cases, it will be the more it seems more Aristotelian, but it is also equally Stoic to work despite the fact that you're feeling fear.
So Ben had a question. He'd like me to read it for him. How does the Stoic concept of fortitude relate to or differ from modern notions of resilience and antifragility?
I would say there's a lot of overlap there. the notion of resilience is one of those things where you ask, 10 experts and you get 10 different answers about what exactly it consists in. So I think we'd have to pin down what a person precisely means by it. I think it covers a lot of the same grounds as what we're talking about here, is perseverance and industriousness. And maybe some of what they called, the megalopsychia, or, being able to rise above things, because that means being able to put things in perspective. The antifragility thing is kind of an interesting take to think about, particularly in terms of how we bounce back from failure, right? So anti-fragile things aren't perfect, and they're not like armored against everything else, and they take some damage and sometimes even real trauma, but they're able to, sort of self-organize and reorganize in ways that then make them stronger as a result. And so would that describe what a Stoic courageous response would be when you've actually failed? I think it probably would. So I think that could be a helpful criterion. Are we making ourselves more, as persons, more anti-fragile by the way in which we're approaching our failures? I mean, the opposite would be, oh, I failed. Oh, everything's doom and gloom. I'll never be able to show my face or do anything again. That's not just a lack of resiliency. That's also being fragile, right? You're completely shattered. And it's interesting that you asked that too, because we're going to come back from this crisis and things are going to be changed in so many ways. Some of them for the worse, some of them for the better. And it's going to be in response to what we go through. I mean, we're, the more pessimistic predictions are we're only in the very beginning of our self-quarantining and social isolation and stuff like that. We might be going on for months and months and months. And, the economy is going to look quite different when we're finished with this. There's going to be a lot of, my wife has a lot of connections in the food and restaurant industry. They're really hurting right now. A lot of restaurants are going to go under. And what's going to be left after we're done, we'll have to see how the whole industry is able to bounce back. And when we say that whole industry, we mean all these other people whose livelihoods are dependent upon it. Many people, it's their entry-level jobs. So, I guess we'll see which systems are actually anti-fragile as well.
Stoic Dan, you had a question. Feel free to unmute yourself. Oh, I think I might have to. Yeah, you can unmute yourself now, Dan.
Great, thank you. Earlier in your talk, Greg, you mentioned that Stoics have a zero tolerance to anger. And that's usually the way I would describe it as well. But just yesterday, I was listening to Massimo talk on another call like this, and he said that sometimes a Stoic will need to show anger to snap someone into doing the right thing, kind of like that rare oddity that we sometimes hear about, a Buddhist teacher slapping his student. But Massimo added that you should not feel anger inside, you should only display it, and this should be rare. What do you think about that?
Well, that's exactly what Seneca said. That's the example in On Anger of the judge who appears to be angry. So displays, they don't display anger in the sense of acting from anger within them. They display the conventional appearance of anger, like raising their voice and, maybe like they make themselves get red in the face or something like that we can imagine. So that's pretty straightforward. There is actually a debate going on right now about, well, maybe the Aristotelians, who the Stoics, by the way, misrepresented, I'll mention as well. If we look at the ancient, texts and stuff like that, a little bit on this, maybe the Aristotelians were a bit right in thinking that anger would be needed to galvanize people to doing what's right, on a larger scale in terms of getting our politicians to take the dangers to working class people and I mean, here's a great example. Here in Milwaukee, we've had 10 deaths now, and all of them have been on the north side of Milwaukee in the poor neighborhoods. So there's clearly, some things that need to be attended to. And I think, could anger get the politicians to pay more attention to public health things? Yeah. The problem is that when we use anger for activism, like Seneca and Aristotle point out, anger gets away from you really easily. It's kind of a blunt instrument. And so, as Seneca says, anything that we could accomplish with anger, we could accomplish just by following right practical reasoning. And so, whether or not we can get mass movements going without it, I don't know. But we can certainly, as individuals, act appropriately without using anger. So if I see my child being bullied, anger could spur me to take a stand against that, but it could also lead me to going over and punching the bullying kid's dad in the face or something like that. And we don't want those sorts of excessive reactions. So anger is always kind of dangerous. Even if we think a little bit could be okay, if we want to use that meme, we can have a little bit of anger as a treat sometime. No, it's still kind of dangerous to do it.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. Okay, let's do this one. So this is from Greg Lopez, our friend from New York. So Epictetus asked us to transfer aversions from externals to our internal state. What's the balance of blaming yourself without also inflaming secondary passions about how you have a failing? Can you give an example of how you do it?
Okay, that's a good one. And yeah, Epictetus in the Enchiridion suggests transferring aversions entirely from externals. I think some of the stuff that he says in the discourses modifies that a bit, but let's say that we're actually doing this. So we're trying to focus entirely inward on our own, and we could look at it as failings, right? So we should be averse to being, and let's use it in terms of the virtues, right? Let's say we realize that we're a little greedy, and that means that we want to take more than our fair share of things, which then leaves other people in the lurch. It could be like toilet paper, for example, right? And hurting in this crisis. I don't know if it's been happening in Canada, but it's a big problem here in the States for some reason. It's the only crisis where we've actually seen this weird behavior with toilet paper. So you realize that you're getting caught up in the hysteria about, we better get out and get as many rolls as possible. Now you instead of being averse to not having toilet paper, if we're following Epictetus, it'd be averse to being the kind of jerk who goes out and takes what other people need and hoards it up. And then now that would require us to look at, what's going on with me? What's wrong with me that I do this sort of thing? And now we start to carry out some analysis. And so there's, what's going to help us doing that? Is it beating our breasts and saying mea culpa? No, that's not particularly productive. As a matter of fact, some people do that sort of thing precisely so they don't have to engage in self-analysis. They feel like they've gotten themselves off of the charge that they were involved in before. We'd have to actually look, why am I so concerned about having this one commodity? What am I afraid of? What am I being averse to? So now we're engaging in introspection, and we're using sort of Stoic categories to do that. Now, how would we avoid not blaming ourselves in other ways? There's the blaming yourself, like getting yourself off of the hook for doing that, which is just a show. But what about actually feeling, I'm a really bad person for doing this? That's not going to be particularly productive either. How do we avoid that? We could say to ourselves things like, I screwed up, and my screwing up makes sense given the things that I know about myself. It's not a good thing for me to do this, and I'd like to move away from this, but I don't have to self-lacerate in order to get past this. Or there might be other emotions too, like anger directed at other people. It's those other people who made me do this. No, the other people didn't make you do that. You have a proeresis, you have your own faculty of choice. You decided to allow yourself to get caught up in the toilet paper hoarding hysteria. So can I give an example of how I do it? Hopefully the toilet paper one gives an example, but could we think about other ways that aren't quite so silly that we could do this, and other secondary passions? Maybe, so one interesting one, and this is where we move to where Stoicism and existentialism could overlap. If you think about anxiety, the way that existentialists interpret anxiety in many cases is an awareness of our own freedom that realizes that we could screw up. We could screw up in ways that would be catastrophic. And Kierkegaard has the example of the guy who stands at the edge of the cliff and feels anxiety. He knows that he's not going to throw himself off because that would be stupid to do, but you never know. Maybe I would do that sort of thing, right? And I don't think that Stoics would be immune to that. We are conscious of our own freedom. But if we understand that dynamic there and we recognize the emotions as they're coming up and what they involve, the cognitive judgments that they imply, we can sort of short circuit them. And they won't go away entirely, most likely. I know they don't for me, right? But we can keep them from having the deciding voice in what's going to happen. So they're not influencing the proeresis, the faculty of choice, or the ruling principle, if you like, the other term for that, the hegemonikon. Does that address it sufficiently, you think, or not?
Greg, did you want to respond to that, Greg Lopez? Just indicate on the chat or go off mute. If not, then we will end here. So yeah, in a moment I'll do some closing announcements, but I thought, I'll just say this, that if you want to practice your Stoicism, this place of the Stoa is not going to always be a place to kind of like inquire into Stoicism, but we're going to try to develop an ecology of practices where we can kind of like build this muscle of fortitude. And this is a collective, we're going to source the collective intelligence to do this. So if you have any ideas, let us know, let me know. So before I make some closing announcements, Greg, do you have any closing thoughts of what you're doing now, where people can find you?
Well, as I said, I'm on Twitter as Philosopher70, and obviously my YouTube channel. Just Google and it'll pop right up. Reason.io is just reasonio.com, and I do have a few other things here and there. And I would say I am editor of Stoicism Today. There's a lot of great articles that we're having coming in by guest authors. So modernstoicism.com is where that's cited. Otherwise, yeah, and I think what you're doing here is a really great idea. I actually I'll talk with you later. I've got a few suggestions about people you might tap to bring into it. And I don't have much more to say.
Very cool. And I put all that information of where to find more about Greg in the chat box. And I'll make some announcement about upcoming events. But Greg, thank you, my friend, for coming in today. That was a treat.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for being on the call and giving the excellent questions that you gave. So we have a bunch of events. I think we have like 16 lined up. You can go on the website, www. I'll write in the chat box, stoa.ca. And also go on the mailing list there. You can kind of get updates.